Hey everybody, welcome back to the Centerville Grace Podcast, where every single week we work really hard to bring you a little bit closer and build community based off the Sunday message. We're on location today.
We are on location.
Why don't you tell everybody where we are?
We are in my kitchen at my house.
Which, if you know the Sturks, you know that they have an incredible gift of hospitality. So it's an honor to be here today, and
Honor to have you.
I'm glad it worked out. Yeah, I will.
Great.
Unfortunately, Pastor Dave is prepping for our national convention, which you and I will connect with tomorrow and Wednesday. And so we're excited to jump up there. We miss Dave, obviously, whenever he's not on the podcast.
I know. We have to do so much more talking.
Especially what's on a message he preached.
Yeah, well, that's convenient.
Well, let's jump off with a week in review. What was your highlight from last week?
Oh, I always forget that you're going to ask that every single time. I need to pre-prep that question.
I meant to tell you before we hit record.
Oh, my gosh. This week was a pretty uneventful week, to be honest with you. We had... Like I said, we did all the birthday party
4th
stuff.
Of July,
we actually had our last life group on Sunday night.
Oh, wow.
So this is kind of cool. Actually, we went through our very first Discover Grace group. So if you have not been through that yet, if you're a member of CG or attending CG, first of all, big plug, you should go through that. Mm-hmm. But the way it works now in the new system, which has been cool, is Pastor Dave and Beth get them at their place for 4 weeks. So they get some personal interaction with the pastor. And then we take on that life group and we go through curriculum. This last one, we went through pretty much the entire book of Practicing the Way, John Mark Comer, which we're big fans of, and did some spiritual formation stuff. And we just graduated that group. And hopefully we've got 2 to 3 to 4 to maybe 6 new life group leaders forming out of that, who are going to then launch new groups in the fall.
It's incredible. And so all that to say is that if you're looking for a life group, now is the time to get connected. Dust, what's the best way to get connected to a life group if they need one?
Yeah, right off the bat, man, just email me. I've got a list. We're still trying to get it all systematized and make sure that we know exactly who's meeting and when. But we're getting that list. But just email me. I will connect you with a group, and I've got a list of the new groups that are going to be starting here in the fall when school kicks back off. So now's the perfect time to start thinking about it and just be ready. When fall starts, there's going to be a place for you to go.
Love that. For me, week in review, the highlight is always the 4th of July. We live in historic Centerville, downtown Centerville. So from my house, we can literally walk to all of the festivities.
Which is super convenient.
Super convenient. And I can almost watch the parade, which is, I don't know how you feel about small town parades. I have a love-hate relationship with them.
I haven't been to one in decades, but...
So here's the thing. Everyone basically lines up in order to look at their own kids in the parade. So the parade is made up of people who live in the community, and that's great. But it's also kind of like, I don't need to be here for this.
Yeah. Well, as I've been driving through Centerville, you see all the lawn chairs.
All the lawn chair season in Centerville. I love it.
Weeks in advance. Yeah.
Well, that's the week in review, and I'm sure Pastor Dave would have something awesome to say. He got to golf last week with Corwin, one of the missionaries that we work with Athletes in Action. So
good for him. And he's a pretty serious golfer.
He is, if not, he's competitive. That's for sure.
Listen, we discovered that yesterday. There might be some therapy coming, but we're talking through it.
Good. Well, let's jump into this week's text. We're still in the Gospel of Luke, as we are all year. We're going to look at chapter 11. What are the verses? 37 through 44. Now, this is part of a much bigger picture of Luke that we might jump into a little bit, but we had a great conversation yesterday about generosity. Dust, would you read the text?
Yep. So starting in 37. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him, so he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisee, clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people, did not the one who made you outside make the inside also? But now as for what's inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to the Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it."
That's tough.
Yeah, those are tough statements.
I was thinking that maybe, so one of the unfortunate parts about going through the text the way that we are is that we can't hit all of the text. How would you feel about reading just to the end of the chapter? And maybe we'll touch on that briefly before we go back on the sermon itself.
Yeah, we can do the end of the chapter. So this is picking up in 45, and this is the second half. It says, one of the experts in the law answered him, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also." Jesus replied, "And you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill, and others they will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that's been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the keys to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering." When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and began to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say.
So here's why the end of that text is really important from my perspective, is this is essentially Jesus drawing a line in the sand about what kind of behavior is coming from the institutionalized church. Mm-hmm. So there's not many times where Jesus is so outspoken against the Pharisees as he is in this moment. And he's really basically saying, like, now is the time to really kind of say, I'm over here and you're over here, and we're just doing this differently. As you read the end of that text, what pops into your mind?
Yeah, I think the same thing. It's making sure we're not missing the forest for the trees. Obviously, we're in ministry in some capacity.
Right.
And, I think for us, you read through all the woes. It's like, woe to you, woe to you. It's like, oh, shoot, that's us too. But making sure that the challenge is to maintain the spirit of what the law God gave us is supposed to do without making sure that we're always sticking to the word of the law and missing the spirit behind it. So he's saying, like, hey, you give a tenth of this and you do this. You do all these things, correct on paper, but you're completely missing the spirit of why you're doing it.
I think one of the things that's interesting about this is when he talks about the generation, right? Because he says, therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world. As I read that, I'm inclined, and I haven't done a ton of study about this. This is kind of just going off of memory, but I'm inclined to suggest that part of the reason that that's said is because this is the generation that would crucify Jesus. Yeah. So there's a foreshadowing in this part of the text to say that all the things that happened before now will kind of come to this summation of saying, hey, you murdered Jesus. This is the generation that murdered Jesus. You suck. We're out.
Yep. Which doesn't mean we're off the hook, because metaphorically we did too. But,
Right. I think one of the interesting parts about this is when Jesus talks about, you killed all the prophets that have gone before, what he's saying is you're killing the movement of God. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes we can get so legalistic, it's easy for us to kill the movement that the Lord intended for us.
Yeah.
When you think about the tension between legalism and what happens when we, follow Jesus and be free-spirited, how do you live in that tension personally?
Yeah, it's a really hard one, because a lot of us, depending on how you grew up, like I grew up in a pretty conservative, but also pretty legalistic Christian upbringing. So I've got a little bit of a trigger when it comes to legalism in any form. Right. Now, we can ride this to two different extremes, right? We can say, hey, legalism is terrible. Most of the things that Jesus said, he was really speaking against the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious elite of the time and saying, hey, you guys are doing all these things on paper, but you're abusing the poor, you're giving this, but you're actually completely ignoring people who I'm commanding you to love. But making sure that, I don't go so far as to say that doesn't mean we are free to do anything, right? We have freedom, but freedom is to serve a purpose. Freedom is to make sure it's the freedom to love the way that Jesus commands us to love, right? So if it's important for us, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, with the generosity piece, to follow the spirit of the law in what we're doing, because that's what God desires for us to do. But at the same time, to make sure that we're not using, the opposite of legalism as an excuse to do whatever we want because we don't want to be legalistic. That's the tension I wrestle with myself.
Sure.
Is like, I never want to be legalistic, but I also want to make sure that doesn't mean I'm just, basically creating a vision or a version of Jesus in my head that's not really the real Jesus.
I think one of the things that where I've kind of come to this conclusion is that I grew up in a very liturgical church, and sometimes liturgy can feel like legalism, even though it's not necessarily.
Yeah, which can you unpack that for somebody that doesn't know what a liturgical church experience is?
Liturgical would be, it's more defined. So in the Catholic Church, the idea of there's two parts of the liturgy. Liturgy is another term for service, right? Like a church worship service. And so in the Catholic Church, there's two parts to the liturgy. There's what they call the liturgy of the word, which is where they read the gospel and the Psalms and an Old Testament reading. And then there's liturgy of the Eucharist, where they break bread and recreate the Last Supper. Those two parts of the liturgy are put together to form what is the Catholic Mass, the liturgy of the Catholic Mass. And so it's very structured. You could go to any Catholic church on any given Sunday, and they're all basically doing the same things.
Yeah.
Right? It's all kind of centered around one major tree trunk, so to speak.
Yeah. And maybe packaged a little differently.
Yeah, maybe
from
packaged
church
a little
to
different.
church,
But for the most part, it's all going to look the same. You're going to say the same things. It's very rote, right? And here's why liturgical churches do that. They do that because the law can be a really good tool in disciple making. The law can help give you good theology. The law can help you prevent yourself from making Jesus in your own image, to your point, right? And so that's the tension. And so when I look at laws in the text, one of the things that I often wrestle with is, does this help me follow Jesus more clearly, or does it become a barrier to me following Jesus? And so the life of Jesus then supersedes the law because Jesus is the ultimate example.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good explanation to that. I think sometimes it's almost based on our personalities too, right?
Sure.
Because I worked in a liturgical church for a couple of years. It was a Lutheran church. And coming from a not liturgical background, the first time I stepped into, lead worship in that environment, it's like, oh, there's like a chant that happens here, and the pastors come down with the swiggy things. Yeah. And like you hear the same prayers are kind of scripted from week to week, and there's a ritualism about it. But I think for a lot of people, there was a comfort in that because it's like, hey, this is the unchanging word of God. And I think, when we come into out of the evangelical tradition, a lot of times we've kind of come so far away from that it's like, hey, we're free to do whatever we want, however we want, and we can create some really creative services, which the creative side of me appreciates.
Yeah, sure.
But at the same time, I think there's, once again, it's a tension to manage between what is the purpose of the law and what does that do for us in the normative expressions that we would do every single Sunday, and where's the comfort in that? Like, should we be confessing to each other every week? Well, yeah, we should be. We don't necessarily have a place in our church services to do that, but it's part of the Christian life.
That's part of the spiritual disciplines.
Yeah. So it's fine. How do we do both of those well is the question there.
Right. But, and I would say, of course, this already, I would say the answer is really intentional disciple making, right? In those personal relationships, we can get those disciplines that we can't always hit on the corporate level.
Yep.
Because we're designing corporate worship as an on-ramp into the relationship with Christ. Sometimes we just don't have enough space to put all of those nuanced disciplines in.
Yeah. You can't build that goes to say, you can't build your entire life around just attending church on Sunday,
right? Or
else you're missing a huge richness of what we're actually called to do as we make disciples, which is why we are who we are, I think, as a church.
Amen. Amen to that. Now, when we think about this message on generosity, one of the things that Pastor Dave made really clear is how challenging it is for pastors to talk about this idea of generosity. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Where do you think that stems from?
Oh, I think it stems from a lot of things. I would argue, we have a couple things going against us in Western society, at least society most of us were brought up in if you grew up in the United States. We have, the individualism, which is, hey, I am in control of my destiny. Therefore, I'm the first person who determines what I do with my income out of the job that I choose to work. And it's up to me to make sure I'm responsible for my family. And, there's a pressure there, I think, that if you're not fully trusting in God, Sometimes we try to control our finances and our generosity, and not just our money. We talk about other forms of generosity.
Sure.
There's time generosity and all these things, but it's almost like this scarcity mentality. It almost comes out of fear more than anything else. Not that a lot of us are, I think, trying to be disobedient, but there's a fear behind it. Well, will God really take care of me if I give him 10% before I even know what my bills are this month? Like, can I really trust God to make sure he provides for me? And I think that's really hard for a lot of people that have been Christians even for a long time, is how much do you really trust God to do that? Because that's what the exercise is, right?
Yeah.
It's an exercise in trust and heart formation.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is somewhere along the way, our culture decided that we shouldn't talk about money. Mm-hmm. And the church adopted that posture. Now, to be fair, the church has done a lot of things inappropriately with money. Not our church, but like the historic church. Well, just kidding. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Right? But like indulgences, if we think about this historically, where the church used to sell passes to heaven in exchange for funds. And so that became really kind of a corrupt, there were a lot of years where the historic church was very corrupt.
Yeah, there's a church I just read an article yesterday. There's a church, I don't know where it is, but somewhere in Mexico right now, who's now getting blasted all over the news for selling plots of land in heaven. Oh, so that kind of is still happening in some capacity.
That's so sad,
It
right?
is.
And what happens is that our sin gets in the way of the pure message that the Lord intended, I think.
Yeah.
And so the historic church has got some sin issues around money, and it's just kind of trickled down to, hey, we don't talk about money. And this is also where culture really influences this kind of stuff, because for so long it wasn't considered polite to talk about money. How do you guys and your family handle that discussion with your kids? Probably just your oldest at this point, but
Yeah, we haven't, he's still young enough that he doesn't really know what money is. I mean, he does,
Right.
But I think he just said the other day, he's like, oh, that's $20. Oh, that's not a lot of money. We should buy that. It's like, well, first of all, you don't know what a lot of money is, because you've never worked a day in your life,
Right.
Nor do you understand the value of anything yet, because you're just not old enough to really comprehend that. It's like, what's a lot of money? I don't know, $5 million? What's a little bit of money? $100?
all relative, isn't it?
It's all relative.
Yeah, we try to lean into this idea about giving time, talent, and treasure, and working towards a tithe with our kids. And even before Connor left to go to college, we had a conversation about what does, you're not going to have a local church for a while. Where do you want to give? What's it look like? And and at some point you just kind of plant the seeds and hope it takes root.
Yeah. I think a big part of that conversation is just generosity in general.
Yeah, in general.
Like, what is it to live a generous life? Because, once again, if we get beyond the letter of the law of what we're supposed to do with our finances, it's also just how are we going to be generous in life? And I know for a lot of us, once again, something that we're cultured into is, our time is just as valuable, if not more valuable, than our money, right? And that's one thing that we are absolutely time poor in the United States.
Yes.
And, I always want to tell people, like, man, you can be generous in a lot of ways. Like, is it important to be financially generous with your stewardship? Yes, it is, because that's a trust exercise. Is it also maybe equally, if not even more important, to be generous with your time and with how you, bring others into your spaces and how much you spend time with people? Like, absolutely it is.
One of the things I appreciated about the way that Dave tackled the text is that he started with this idea about washing the hands and what all that meant. And he said it's an external reminder that God wanted a clean heart, that the hands were not nearly as important as the heart. I think it's hard for us as American Christians to see our own blind spots.
Yeah.
How do you clean your heart?
Oh, gosh, that's a loaded question. I mean, I think this is one thing I've really come to know in the last few years, especially. And this kind of ties back to what we're talking about with having people in our life that help us become better disciples.
Yeah.
Is I need people around me to call those things out within me. I can spend time praying. I can spend time with the Lord. Obviously, that's tremendously important. But, equally important, maybe not equally, but almost as important, is finding community that can help you become the kind of person that Christ calls us to. Because a lot of times we can't do that on our own, right? We're not a good judge of ourselves. We give ourselves a lot more permission than we give a lot of other people. Like I know with myself,
Sure.
I would give myself a whole lot more freedom than I would give somebody else I'm
Right.
trying to hold to a standard, because, well, I can come up with an excuse for anything. But, just having people in my life that can call those things out, who can challenge me and push me, like, hey, how is your relationship with God? How are you doing with financial stewardship? How are you with taking quiet time before the Lord? Like, I'm just not good at doing that on my own. I don't think we're designed to do that on our own. We need people around us, which is, once again, goes back to disciple making.
Well, and there's a reason why we call them blind spots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus to the Pharisees says that, you clean the outside of the cup, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness, and it's convicting.
Yeah. Like you can do all the right things and do it with the wrong motive and still be just as bad off.
Absolutely. And so, I think that a reminder, I think of the psalmist that says, create in me a clean heart, O Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I desire. And working towards that. Repentance is a spiritual discipline that I lean into. And then obviously being around people, because they call them blind spots for a reason. And it's it's hard for us.
Yeah.
It's hard for me.
Yeah. And we all have them, whether we think we do or not.
Right.
But you're not going to find them yourself. You need somebody else to call those out within you.
And it's such a challenge because it hurts.
Yep, it does. It does. Hurts the pride.
It hurts the pride. One of the things that happens here is that Jesus calls the Pharisees out. Like it's the beginning of this language, and he talks to them about their generosity and about connecting the people of God to the needs of the world and charity. When you think about a rebuke, like what Jesus does here, have you ever been in a situation where you've been rebuked, rightfully so?
I mean, probably not as often as I should have been, if we're going to be fully honest.
Right.
I'm pretty good, like just as a skill set. And this is something I just know about myself. I'm pretty good at covering my bases, right? Which is a dangerous thing. So I've needed to put people personally in my life and given them active permission to say like, hey, you may not notice these things because I'm pretty good. Like I can, like I'm not trying to make it sound weird or anything, but I know myself enough that like I could cover up anything I wanted to cover up if I really tried.
Yep.
Like I need people in my life that I give permission to say like, hey, I need you to be that person that can look deep inside of me and actually point these things out. And I promise you, I will not take offense. I will get my feelings hurt, but I'll get over it. But it's for the purpose of, it's for the purpose of becoming more like God. So like when Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees here, I don't think that the goal necessarily was just to say, hey, you're all doing terrible things. I think the goal was he was trying to make them more Christ-like.
Yeah.
Right. He was saying, hey, these are blind spots and these are things you need to work out on this side of heaven and get figured out.
And there's a reason Jesus spent a lot of his time speaking to that culture, because it was his primary community. That was his people. That was his church. Right. And so kind of rebuking that in relationship, or at least in, Jesus was the teacher. They came to challenge Jesus. They invited him into the space. And so it would have been appropriate and customary for him to teach. And when those teachings then begin to insult the people in the room, there's an aversion to it. And so I think sometimes I'm reminded that it's really good to be around teaching that's hard and teaching that hurts.
It is. And I think that might be the hardest thing about, once again, how we are in Western society, because that's something we don't do well with at all. Even worse than how we do with talking about finances in the church is how do we tell people things in truth without offending them? Because as well as I do, and like we live in an offense society.
I internally applauded Dave when he talked about yesterday the idea that some people give to Starbucks and don't give to the church.
Yep.
And man, I'm a coffee drinker, as are you.
Yep.
And so quite a bit of my, I put some money into coffee. Throughout the course of a month, I put some money into coffee. But the good news is we've also practiced generosity, and so we've dialed in our tithe and understand that to be the floor of our giving, not the ceiling. So I like a little good conviction.
I mean, I do too, because I think it's so needed.
Yeah.
But you have to be open to it ahead of time. And like, who are the people in your life that you're giving permission to speak those things to you? Maybe it's not going to be one of your church pastors that you're going to give that permission. Like, we can do it in a corporate sense, but it's not like we're going to say, oh, John over there, I know what we're not going to do anything like that.
These two people, why aren't you giving? What does that look like? What's it mean?
At least a good pastor should not be publicly rebuking. Terrible idea. But we need to have people in our lives that we give permission to do that.
And if you don't have it, then you're probably not operating inside a Christian community the way that it was intended, right?
Yeah.
And, when you guys were talking about the life group, that's the whole reason why we're in Christian community. That's why we do disciple making, is so that we have someone to call us out on those moments of our lives.
Yeah, all these things we do, man. If we're doing what God's calling us to do correctly, even at CG, is everything's intended not to make you more busy, but to make you more Christ-like, right? So like the corporate services have a role to play. That's so we can learn how to worship together and we can proclaim the word together and practice, these public declarations of glorifying God together. Life groups have a role because you need community in your life at another level deeper. And that ultimately points to the most important relationship, which is that disciple-making relationship where you need somebody who knows you well enough that can come to you and call out all your stuff, and that you get permission to, because that's the only way you're going to become more Christ-like.
One of the places where Pastor Dave kind of landed the plane and was this idea about creating a plan for giving. And so I'm curious, we get to go a little bit deeper here. We make it a little bit more personal. How do you and Nicole kind of create that plan for giving? How do you guys approach it? What's that look like in your life? I'm looking for tips and tricks. What I'm looking for.
Sure. I mean, I will say, like we've been blessed enough that money's never been something that we've had to talk about a lot. I know with a lot of people, it's like that's one of the biggest indicators of divorce. It's a real thing. Stressor in marriages across the board. We've been in positions where I don't know if it's because we're both really independent. Like if I were to tell you that even to this point we have separate bank accounts, that triggers a whole lot of people and all my financial planners and all that stuff. We have a reason for that I can get into at another time. But we practice, our generosity in a couple different ways. Like I tithe my tithe, Nicole tithes her tithe. We pay different things out of different places because it works for us and how our lives are kind of separated. Because I have a business, she runs a thing. But within that, we do certain things together. And where we come together for our tip for our family is we come together in the hospitable piece. Like, hey, what can we do together to bless others? And sometimes that just looks like, hey, let's just go call a bunch of people and be like, hey, who wants ice cream? We're just going to go start delivering some food to people's houses or some ice cream to people just to bless them. And, we've got a plan right now that we're talking about of how can we start getting into some, like Nicole's college that she went to. It's like, hey, when the new freshmen move in, how can we do something to bless those incoming freshmen? We started having that conversation, which we're hoping to pull the trigger on this year. So there's almost like projects that we kind of do together that really invigorate us because, we've got the discipline of tithing, but there's also other things that we want to do to be generous. And usually that comes in a little bit more creative ways for us. So maybe talk through it as a family, as a tip, and just like, hey, what's the thing that's important to your heart that you can bless others with? That might just be open up your house in hospitality. It might be, going and delivering presents on Christmas to a family, may not be able to get the presents they need. There's all kinds of ways we can do that if you're creative.
I really do. I heard a pastor once talk about radical generosity, like anything over the floor, the 10%. So Karen and I, several years ago, we went through Financial Peace University and created a common language and common theology around money. And I think there's a lot of couples that don't have a common theology around what they're going to do with their money.
Yeah.
And so, and that's typically when people feel, when you haven't talked about it as a couple, you're not going to want to talk about it as a part of the community. And that's just real, So if you're uncomfortable with this discussion, let me just encourage you to talk about it as a couple first, or talk about it as a family first, and then you'll be much more open to it. So once we created some common theology about what we believed money is there to do, it became a lot easier to be generous with it.
Yeah.
It's really how the abundance mindset was created in our life. And so, tithing and then radical generosity, things like what you're talking about, these projects and supporting people and like that kind of stuff has become paramount to the work that we do. And, we try to always align some of our heart passions with our extra giving too. So my wife's passionate about ending human trafficking. And so that's a big part of our giving every year. I'm passionate about recovery. And so that's a big part of our giving every year on top of what we do to the local storehouse. And some years it's more and some years it's less, but we always have a plan like, hey, let's go over and above X amount when we get there.
Yeah, that's really, it's so important to have that baseline. Scripture calls for 10% and, but past that, it's like, man, we should always be striving to be more generous year after year. I know that's kind of our rule of life that as we talk about family rules, like how do we be more generous every year as if, however God blesses us, how can we use those things? Just assume that nothing is ours anyways.
That's good. That's good. Okay, let's jump into the last segment of the podcast.
Yeah.
pastoral recommendations. Do you have one? You want me to go first?
No, I've got one.
You got one. All right.
Believe it or not.
You almost always remember the PR, but you always forget the week in review.
Yeah, that's probably something that says deep about my psyche there. I don't know what yet, but we'll talk about it later.
I love it.
Oh, man. Yeah, because I like to research. It's always easier for me.
Yeah.
But I would say this, because it goes right with our conversation. I would say, if you're in a family, even if you're married, even if you're not, start thinking about what are things that are important to you to create a family rule of life. I know we talk a lot about rule of life, but doing that as a family is ultimately going to reach into every area of how you live your life and how you prioritize what you do versus your time, your finances, what we value as a family. All that comes from who do we want to be? How do we want to spiritually allow God to form us? And start building those rules now. That's been tremendously important. And sadly, we didn't get into all that until probably a couple years later than we should have, even in our marriage and our family life. But those are game changers.
And I found too, we've done the rule of life for a number of years. They change as seasons change, right? And our family dynamic changes. You have to completely tweak the rule. You're not going to trash it and start over again, but tweaking them all the time, tweaking them.
Yeah, and life looks very different, as you know, when you got kids going to college versus when we've got kids going into grade school. It's very different.
Very different. My PR would be to check out Financial Peace University. If you haven't developed a theology around this yet, I recommend Dave Ramsey's stuff. Dave Ramsey can be a polarizing figure in the Christian world, but I'll tell you that his theology around finances drastically changed mine and Karen's life, and how we handle debt and the debtor being slave to the lender and all of those kind of things that are tools to help us be more generous, right? We look at eliminating debt as a way to be more generous, and it kind of opens things up. So Financial Peace University, Dave Ramsey, he's got a whole suite of stuff there that you can check out. And again, I mentioned this on Sunday in the announcements, but if you are interested in signing up for Financial Peace University or want to be a part of a group, we'd be happy to start one at the church. So just email me, Tony@centervillegrace.org, and we'll lean into that with you, because your financial freedom matters to us as you follow Jesus. It creates a lot of opportunities.
Yep, it does.
Well, friends, that's our podcast for today. We're always thankful to be with you. As always, the highest compliment you can give us, share this episode with a friend, maybe somebody who can help hold you accountable to the blind spots you have about money. And hey, we look forward to connecting with you next week as we, guess what, surprise, continue in the Gospel of Luke.
Oh, you had me.
We'll see you guys real soon.
Bye.